Imagine being lowered into the ground, the weight of the earth pressing down around you, and then slowly you begin to wake up. You cough, you sputter, you try to move, but it's too late. The world above has moved on without you. You are buried alive. For centuries, this was a common fear. So much so that elaborate coffins were designed with escape hatches in case someone was buried too soon. Welcome back, everyone. I'm your host, and this is our channel. Today we're going to look at the creepy invention that was the Iron Coffin. Some people say that death is a relief, an escape from the pain and suffering that life sometimes brings. But for those left behind, death can be a terrifying process. For most of human history, there have been few things more frightening than the finality of death. The idea that once you go, and that there's no coming back. Even now, if someone is missing and presumed dead, we say they've kicked the bucket or shuffled off this mortal coil, phrases that acknowledge the great unknown that awaits us all. It wasn't until the mid-19th century that science began to be able to explain what happened to the body after death. Before then, it was anyone's guess. And as such, there was a lot of speculation and folklore surrounding the period immediately following death, when the living become the dead. This time is often referred to as the intermediate state, a time when the soul is neither in heaven nor hell, but stuck somewhere in between. Sometimes the idea of the intermediate state was viewed optimistically, as a chance for good people to atone for their sins before they ascended to heaven. Other times, the idea of the intermediate state was downright terrifying. What if someone who wasn't fully dead was buried alive? These fears weren't helped by stories of people being dug up only to find that they still had a pulse. One notable case took place in 1789 when a woman named Margaret Scott was accidentally buried alive. She managed to claw her way out of her grave, and when she was discovered, she was covered in blood and dirt. Stories like these inspired a whole subgenre of fiction in the 19th century, stories about premature burials, disinterment, and restless corpses. The most famous example is probably Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. And some of these stories were based on real events. In 1836, a man named John D. Griffith was exhumed 3 days after his funeral, having been mistakenly declared dead. He was described as being in a state of animation, sitting up in his coffin and trying to break free. It was also said that he was covered in vermin and had eaten some of his own excrement, which may or may not be true. These cases led to some interesting side effects, like the creation of the exhumation order, a legal document that allowed for the exhuming of a body if there was doubt over whether or not the person was actually dead, or the invention of metal coffins, because if a person could be declared dead and then come back to life inside a wooden coffin, what would stop them from doing the same thing in a metal one? There were two answers, really. First, metal coffins were already used for high-profile people like presidents and popes, so it was easy enough to just copy them. Second, early metal coffins were usually made of cast iron, which was incredibly heavy and required a lot of manpower to move. So even if someone was buried alive, they wouldn't be able to get out. But people wanted more. They wanted coffins that were nearly impossible to get out of, coffins that could never be dug up, coffins that were essentially inescapable. And so people started building iron coffins with escape hatches. That last part is right. People were building coffins with escape hatches. In 1824, a man named Thomas M. Barry patented a coffin with a spring lid that would pop open when the person inside tried to sit up. There was also a tube attached to the coffin that would allow the person to call out for help, though it's not clear how exactly this would work. Buried alive, would the person be able to scream? Would the air travel through the tube? Or would someone need to stick their ear up against it? Either way, the coffin didn't catch on, likely because people thought that a tube sticking out of the ground would look suspicious and draw attention to the possibility that someone was buried alive. Another design that was patented in 1824 consisted of a coffin with a ladder attached to the side. The ladder would fold out when the person inside pushed against a spring, and then they could climb up to the top of the coffin and dig themselves free. But this design didn't consider the fact that digging yourself out of a hole while holding a shovel is kind of difficult. Plus, if you needed to use the ladder, that meant you were basically out of time. But in 1828, a third design was patented. This one featured a lever that was activated by a pulley system. When the person inside pulled on the lever, it would open up a trap door in the top of the coffin and allow them to climb out. And finally, this design seemed to take all of the right boxes. It addressed the issues that plagued the previous designs, but it still didn't catch on, likely because it looked pretty suspicious. Just imagine walking through a graveyard and seeing a trap door open up in the middle of a coffin. But then in 1833, the perfect design was patented. This coffin had a hinged lid that opened up like a book. The hinges were designed in such a way that once the lid was opened, it couldn't be closed again from the outside, meaning that the person buried inside would have no trouble getting out, but no one would be able to close the coffin if they were still inside. There was only one problem with this design. It was kind of expensive. The first cost of the materials, which included a layer of brick around the coffin to keep animals from digging it up, was around $200, equivalent to about $6,300 today. On top of that, the coffin needed to be buried at least 5 feet under to ensure that no one would stumble upon it. So you needed to pay for all the extra dirt that would need to be moved. Despite the price tag, rich people ate it up. Suddenly, they could rest in peace knowing that even if they were buried alive, they could get themselves out. The coffin was durable enough to last hundreds of years, so their chances of being dug up by mistake were slim to none. And if they did get dug up by mistake, well, they could always just escape. But not everyone was happy about these new iron coffins. In 1848, a man wrote to the editor of the New York Tribune to complain about the trend. He called them a disgrace to the whole body of the dead, saying that they are inconsistent with the respect due to the departed and are offensive to the feelings of the living. His complaints fell on deaf ears, however, and the iron coffin remained popular. By the end of the 19th century, these metal coffins were popping up in cemeteries across the country, including at least one in Green Mount Cemetery in Baltimore. And they weren't limited to America either. The design was patented in Britain, France, Germany, Italy, and even Australia. Today, however, they've fallen out of fashion. One reason for this is that the fear of being buried alive simply isn't as widespread as it once was. Thanks to modern medicine, doctors are able to determine with a fair amount of certainty whether or not someone is dead. And if you aren't dead, you probably don't want to stay buried underground. Another reason is that these metal coffins are just plain creepy. Imagine visiting a cemetery and seeing a coffin suddenly open up. Now imagine that happening in the middle of the night. The image is so unsettling that filmmakers have used it in several horror movies. Perhaps the creepiest aspect of the whole thing, however, is that these coffins are still out there, buried in cemeteries all over the world, silently haunting those who pass by. They serve as a reminder of a time when death was viewed quite differently than it is today, when the line between the living and the dead was much more blurred. So next time you visit a graveyard, keep an eye out for the iron coffin. It might just be hiding something. Thank you for watching, and as always, stay spooky.